Hello everyone, thanks for joining us to the 7th conference of Eastern Circle's Geopolitics Club, where we explore the past, the present, and the future of the post-Soviet region. Coming to an end to our discussion season, which is devoted to the theme of power transition in post-Soviet space. And today we are going to continue this journey by examining the stagnant transition of power in Kazakhstan. My name is Hubert Félix Delattre, and I have the great honor to moderate this conference, which we organize with my two fellows, Charles-Adrien Fourmi.
Hi, Hubert.
And Dylan Van de Ven.
Hi, great to be here today.
So here's a brief look on our program today. Firstly, with the editorial team, we're going to give a quick overview of the main features of Kazakhstan, just to allow you to have the context in mind. Then we're going to listen to our three keynote speakers for an hour-long conference. And finally, you will have the opportunity to ask some questions to the speakers if we have time. So while hearing about Kazakhstan, unfortunately, but please forget about Borat. Today, we are going to show you the real Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is nicknamed the land of the Great Steppe, since its huge territory, which is 5 times larger than France, is mostly occupied by the Great Eurasian Steppe. Nevertheless, it is not only made of steppe, but also of sandy deserts, of emerald mountains, and of skyscrapers, especially in Nursultan, the new-built capital city at the core of the Great Steppe in the north of the country. The name of this city has changed several times, from Akhmola to Tselinograd and Astana. But since 2019, it holds the surname as the first president of independent Kazakhstan. I mean, of course, Nursultan Nazarbayev. And a significant part of our today's session will be devoted to his role in the Kazakhstani political system. If Nazarbayev was able to build a new capital city with such futuristic and fashionable buildings, it is primarily thanks to oil revenues. Indeed, Kazakhstan is rich in natural resources, especially uranium, coal, and oil. The large oil fields, located in the west of the country, in the Caspian Sea region, are jointly exploited by the Kazakhstani National Oil and Gas Company, which is Kazmunaygaz, and also by other foreign companies, such as Total, Chevron, or CNPC. In 2019, Kazakhstan was the 13th biggest oil-producing country in the world, and oil amounted for 17% of the GDP and 2/3 of its exports, mainly towards the European Union. Although Kazakhstan is a geographical giant, it is a demographic dwarf. It has less than 19 million of inhabitants, mainly concentrated in the south and the north of the country. Kazakhstan is a multi-ethnic country. More than 130 different nationalities have been censused. During Soviet times, Kazakhs used to be a minority on their land because of the Great Famine in the 30s, because also of the mass deportations under Stalin times, and also because of the industrialization process. The situation has been reversed. Nowadays, the Kazakhs amount for almost 70% of the population, while the share of the Russians in Kazakhstan population has fallen from 38% to 90%. Nevertheless, as you can see on this map, Russians still constitute most of the population in some regions in the north of the country, and the Russian language is still predominant in the urban areas. So after this very short overview of Kazakhstan's geography, economy, and demography, we are going to see with Charles-Adrien the main foreign policy stakes of this country.
Well, thank you, Hubert, for this great introduction. Indeed, since the end of the Cold War with President Nazarbayev and now with Kazakh leader Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, a career diplomat, self-designed multi-vector foreign policy is still defining how Kazakhstan acts globally among nations, enhancing cooperation with everyone, including the West, for example, the European Union, its #1 export partner and investor. Kazakhstan has grown successfully, as the region's wealthiest country, with a long-term strategy to optimize its impact. It remains geographically between two even wealthier countries, China to the south and Russia to the north. On the left here, a picture of the Korgos Gateway, the flagship Silk Road site, serving as the world's biggest train dry port and strategically located close to China and Almaty, the country's economic hub. On the right, you can perhaps recognize President Tokayev and surely President Putin here exchanging at an official diplomatic meeting in Moscow. A comparison of Russia and China's relations with Kazakhstan while surfing on some of the key indicators shows the future could be much brighter than the past, meaning, despite Russia having key assets in Kazakhstan, China could surely become Nursultan's long-term partner for years to come. First, Russia, whom Kazakhstan always had strong symbolic ties and relations with, illustrated best perhaps in the total 80% of arms sales to Kazakhstan coming from Russia, a key number that made Russia the top security and defense partner for years. In 2019, Russia held the top place for imports, representing 34% of all imports into Kazakhstan, while Kazakh exports to Russia reached a fair 10% of total Kazakh exports. Its economic role remains important, adding that it still entertains many soft power channels into Kazakhstan, translating into 86% of Kazakhs strongly or simply favorable to Russia as a power in the region. Perhaps independently from the Chinese expansion, this momentum is nonetheless challenged by new policies, such as the alphabet changes away from Cyrillic, increased educational and trade investments, promoting English and Mandarin-speaking programs for youth, and pro-Western views, contrasting much with the Russian policies. These policies all aim toward more sovereign and independent opportunities outside of the classic Kazakh-Russian bilateral relations. And second, China's significance is arguably growing at a bigger rate now. First, in security and defense, its role could include future strategic investments with high-tech products, for example, drones, training, or simply more advanced intelligence assets. But it is geoeconomics and Chinese investments that best highlight potential for bright relations between the two countries. Remember that China chose Kazakhstan as the place to launch its Belt and Road Initiative, marked with a speech given by Chinese President Xi Jinping himself at Nazarbayev University in 2013. Since then, the number of projects devoted to Chinese Belt and Road Initiative in Kazakhstan represent an unmatched 40% of total Belt and Road Initiative projects in Central Asia. China invests now more than Russia in Kazakhstan, with 6% of total foreign direct investments in the last 15 years. Kazakh exports more to China than Russia, with 13% of total Kazakh exports. And imports from China, 24% of its total imports, is second only to Russia. But the problem is that this has also been accompanied by growing xenophobia, which made headlines globally and risk splitting the elite and the rest of the population on what is the proper role for China in Kazakhstan. And now my colleague Dylan will present a timeline of the political transition. So Dylan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Zenia. So let's turn inwards into Kazakhstan's domestic policy. Nursultan Nazarbayev, president of Kazakhstan since its independence for over 30 years, announced in early 2019 that he was resigning. Following the constitutional rules, but also with the backing of Nazarbayev himself, the former Senate Speaker at the time, Satpayev, replaced him as interim president. His position was cemented during presidential elections a few months later, while Satpayev still received an overwhelming majority of the vote, with over 70% of the electorate voting for him. This pales in comparison to Nazarbayev's astounding 98% in the presidential elections a few years earlier. This could raise the first question on Satpayev's grip on power in Kazakhstan's politics. Additionally, before Nazarbayev's so-called departure, he adapted the political landscape to make sure that he would be able to retain power as Almaty, or leader of the nation, a new position. This raises further questions regarding the legitimacy and the mandate of the new president, Satpayev. Third, achieving 71% of the vote in this year's parliamentary elections, the Nursultan party, the ruling party since Kazakhstan's independence, remained in power and once again further cemented Satpayev's position as president. However, novel to Kazakhstan, the elections were also marred by non-systemic opposition, which had not occurred before. This indicates that there is a general discontent with the socioeconomic situation in Kazakhstan and poses a further challenge to Satpayev's position beyond his predecessor's continued grip on power. Finally, international observers have criticized the election as being neither free nor fair, as they have done for every election since Kazakhstan's independence. This once again places the fairness and the validity of the elections and thereby Tokaryev's position in doubt. This and more will be discussed by a panel of expert speakers today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adrien and Dylan, for this excellent briefing on the main external and internal policy challenges in Kazakhstan. So now we are going to go deeper into the analysis of the stakes, thanks to our three keynote speakers. So we are very pleased to receive today Catherine Poujol, who is one of the best-known French experts on Central Asia, professor at the National Institute of Eastern Languages and Civilizations in Paris, and who used to be, until last January, the director of the French Institute of Central Asian Studies in Bishkek. It's also a great pleasure to see today among us Mrs. Joanna Lillis, who is a British journalist based in Almaty for 15 years, and the author of a book devoted to the Kazakhstani political scene, which name is Dark Shadows Inside the Secret World of Kazakhstan. Lastly, it's a big honor to welcome today in this panel Mr. Dosym Satpayev, very well-known Kazakhstani political scientist, co-founder of the Alliance of Analytical Organizations of Kazakhstan, and member of the Presidium of Kazakhstan Council on International Relations. Our today's conference will be split in three main topics. So firstly, as we wanted to do also in the introduction, we can begin with the main features of Kazakhstan, just to have in mind the context of this post-Soviet country. Then it will be the core of the conference. We will talk about the kind of transition of power, which is led by the first president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, since 2019. We'll talk also about the political contest, the political contestation in this country. And finally, we will look at the main challenges of Kazakhstani foreign policy. So maybe we could begin with Mrs. Poujol. Can you tell us a bit about the main features of Kazakhstan? What makes Kazakhstan unique as a post-Soviet country on the economical, on the political perspective? What makes it conversely similar to other former republics? So the floor is yours, Mrs. Poujol.
Thank you very much. It's a big honor to begin. So I think it's a little bit of the old generation telling to the young one. So guys, there is a lot of things to do with Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is a very interesting country, very specific, as you said, very unique, because even during Soviet time, you remember that you had Central Asia and Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan was already single place, a single topic, because it's economically very important, very rich with natural reserves, oil, gas, uranium, rare metal, everything from the Mendeleev tables is in the ground, as everybody knows in Kazakhstan. And so economically, the country is very, very perspective. It's a very big country, 2,700,000 square miles. It's like 5 times France, with 19 million inhabitants. And what you can say is the first country to have chosen the liberal economy after the collapse of Soviet Union. So it attracted a lot of investors at the very beginning. And it's a country where the past is very interesting too, with the nomadic culture ground. Also on the political aspect, Kazakhstan is the place, it's the only country in Central Asia where the president has organized himself his successor. So we will talk about that later, but it's a also a very unique case. Unless it was not the case in other countries of the region. And what makes Kazakhstan similar to its Central Asian neighbor is, of course, the Soviet past, the Soviet heritage, which is quite necessary to study if you want to get really deeply into the current politics and social issues in Kazakhstan. You must learn what was Soviet Union in Kazakhstan and what was Kazakhstan for the old Soviet Union. Also, Kazakhstan share with the other 4 countries of Central Asia the Tsarist period, even if it's quite different because the colonization of the steppes was different from the other places, and took a long time to be achieved. And before, if we will not go back on the night of the times, as you can say, but Kazakhstan has a lot in common with the remaining part of what was Turkestan, the south part of Central Asia, because it's a balanced shift between a part of big empire, the Mongol Empire, and so. And after the collapse of this empire, it's the local power like Khanate power or Sultanate Khanate power of Turkish tribes. So they have a lot in common, more than even they say. They want to be different. They are definitely quite different, but they share a DNA in common, which make them very specific from the point of view of the neighbors' countries.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Poujol, for this very good overview of features of Kazakhstan and these historical insights. Maybe Mrs. Lillis, what could you add about that, and maybe more on the political aspect? On your point of view, what are the main features? Like of the regime Nazarbayev has built since independence?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Hubert Felix, and thanks to our hosts at Eastern Circles. Thank you to Catherine for and for a great overview there. Of course, to fellow panelists, Dosym as well. Great to add to the guests. I think I'd just like to maybe talk a little bit about politics, but very, very briefly. And also, I just want to touch on what's special about the politics, and then also what's special about sort of the economy of Kazakhstan, and also just a couple of social issues. So to start off, I'd like to, I think everybody who's here probably knows that Kazakhstan politically is, a very authoritarian country. Not the most authoritarian country in our Central Asian region. But that's because there's some quite stiff competition, unfortunately. So politically, I think we could say that Kazakhstan is characterized by authoritarianism. Now, one of the things I'd like to sort of point out when it comes to politics and the economics and the social issues is a kind of gap that we have in Kazakhstan between rhetoric of the government about how things are in Kazakhstan and how the people see Kazakhstan as well as the government, and reality, which is often there's a very big gap, I find, between those two things. And I think we're here discussing political transition today. And I think that this political transition, I'd be interested to know if fellow panelists agree, has really brought to the fore some of the kind of the difference between how the government sees things and how the people see things. I think that's become very obvious. So authoritarianism, Kazakhstan's never in its history, of 30-year history, held a free and fair election, and elections have certainly over the period that I've been living in Kazakhstan since 2005, they've only become more and more controlled, more and more micromanaged, so that the authorities get the result they want. Now, we had a parliamentary election in January, and I think we'll probably get onto that later. But, again, we see elections without any opposition opposition parties, because virtually no opposition is tolerated on the official arena in Kazakhstan. But there is, of course, opposition in Kazakhstan, and we'll be getting to that too, to talk probably about some of the movements that we see. So we see this authoritarianism, and we see also people push back against that. They don't always accept it. I think increasingly since the resignation of Nazarbayev, under Nazarbayev, people were kind of more accepting of perhaps the status quo. But when Nazarbayev resigned, we saw a big push for change. So we see the government saying that this authoritarianism is a source of stability, and that they are moving towards democracy, but slowly all the time they say that, and see people pushing back against that and resisting. We see dissidents. Economically, the government likes to talk about a stable economy. Obviously, pandemic has influenced every country's economy negatively, but the government talks about Kazakhstan having a stable economy, stable growth that benefits the people. Again, we see a kind of different reality. What do we see? We see Kazakhstan having a very oil-dependent economy. It's been talking for probably about 20 years about solving that problem. The government recognizes this is a problem because every time oil prices go down, the economy kind of goes into some contraction, and people's living standards suffer. Now, we've seen that during the pandemic as well because of the impact on energy consumption and energy prices. So Kazakhstan has suffered a sort of double whammy from lockdowns and the impact on people's habits, but also the impact on energy. But this again exposes the government's kind of mistakes, if you like, over many years of keeping the economy locked into this oil dependency, and also interdependency on Russia as well as fellow members of the Eurasian Economic Union. That can be a problem too. And very briefly, socially, I really couldn't describe Kazakhstan how it is socially in a few minutes because it's such a complex country, and Catherine really I think she touched on that by mentioning how important Kazakhstan's history is, its nomadic past, its the history of colonization by the Russian Empire, by the Soviet Union as well. And so we have a very complex, demographically complex country. We have, lots of ethnic groups, over 100 of them, a very big Russian minority. This impacts geopolitics as well as Kazakhstan's own social sphere. We have a country that speaks two different languages, Russian and Kazakh, as well as many other languages actually, but those are the main ones. I would just like to say that I think also the transition that we're going through now, as well as perhaps the pandemic, have brought to the fore some of the social divisions that we do see in Kazakhstan. The government's very, very, very focused on unity as a nation building exercise, and it's very important, of course, but they tend to kind of brush under the carpet some of the divisions that we see, and we do see increased social divisions. We see a big rich-poor divide, we see a big urban-rural divide, we see a linguistic divide, between Russian speakers and Kazakh speakers, and we see sort of also, sometimes we see different ethnic groups living different kind of lives, and we see sometimes some clashes, including a fatal clash with the Dungun community and Kazakh communities in South Kazakhstan last year. So we have I see a kind of lack of cohesion sometimes when the government talks about unity. I don't want to over-exaggerate that, but there are a lot of social divisions in Kazakhstan. So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lillis, for this very sharp and precise explanation about the main political features of the political regime in Kazakhstan. Let me know we can go deeper on the core of our conference, like the theme of transition of power, if there is a real transition of power. So just for those who are not in course, like 2 years ago, in March 2019, in a surprise decision, the 30-year ruler of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, announced his resignation and gave its status of president to the then Speaker of the Senate, Kassym-Jomart which has been elected, therefore, with 70% of the vote. So some observers maybe thought to be the beginning of a kind of transition of power, but it seems it's not really a transition. So maybe Mr. Satpayev, you could explain us if we can talk about the true power transition of Kazakhstan, Maybe you can explain also the new leader from behind positions of Nazarbayev, such as like the constitutional status of first president, leader of the nation, or head of the Security Council, and also what powers does Nazarbayev still have compared to Tokayev, and how great is his influence in the Kazakh political system?
Okay, well, thank you very much for invitation, and I'm very glad to see Joanne and Catherine. Well, hello. If we return to Kazakhstan, well, I'd like to say when Nazarbayev announced about his resignation in March 2019, I joked that he left in order to stay. Well, it means that President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev is still under the control of the Nursultan Nazarbayev. And the real transition of power, it's my point of view, will begin only with the departure of the first president from the political scene. Well, now, I don't like to talk about the transition mechanism in Kazakhstan. I think now in Kazakhstan, we have half transit period when the first president now still has significant control levers in his hand. It's very important because real transition, I'd like to emphasize, will start when President Nazarbayev will go away from the political scene in Kazakhstan. Well, but now we have another joke in Kazakhstan that Nazarbayev has now taken a very comfortable position. He keeps everything under control. However, he is not responsible for anything formally. Well, also, we should remember that Nazarbayev is not a young person. He is very old, one of the oldest political figures in post-Soviet era. But after Islam Karimov, who has died 2016. Yes, of course, the political time of President Nazarbayev is already running out, and many in Kazakh political elite understand this. And of course, Tokayev just started forming own team. But I'd like to say that now Mr. Tokayev, he doesn't have a wide network of his proteges and both in central and regional authorities. And Mr. Tokayev, he hasn't own person, own loyalty to him person as well in national companies, in regional elite. He doesn't have significant administrative resource. It's very important instrument of power in Kazakhstan. Moreover, President Tokayev received from Nazarbayev the old bureaucratic apparatus and very influential pressure groups. And the most part of these pressure groups now still loyal to the first president. Therefore, now we can see some kind of sabotage by the bureaucratic apparatus of his initiatives and some proposals. Well, yes, of course, now Mr. Tokayev tried to realize different political and economical reform, but I'm not sure that he has a real desire to make strong changes in political system of Kazakhstan. Well, but if we return to the Mr. Nazarbayev, I'd like to say that Nazarbayev tried to save position always system player, as like as Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. Well, you know that after his resignation, I mean, after the resignation of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew worked about 21 years in the position of senior minister and minister mentor, which were especially established for him. Yes, of course, but in compare with Lee Kuan Yew, Mr. Nazarbayev now has 8 more positions besides leader of nation. For example, Nazarbayev now he is lifelong chairman of the Security Council in Kazakhstan. Well, besides that, Mr. Nazarbayev is the chairman of pro-presidential political party Nursultan. And Nazarbayev trying to maintain dominant role of Nursultan party not only in parliament, but also within of the state apparatus. And this is one of the instruments of control over the activity of the second president, Tokayev. Well, it's my point of view. And Mr. Tokayev, he understands that he can't control Nursultan because the chairman of Nursultan, Mr. Nazarbayev, and the deputy of chairman, Mr. Baybek, Baujan Baybek. This is person very close connected with Mr. Nazarbayev. It means that Mr. Tokayev can completely control the lower house of parliament, Majlis, because in Majlis we can see dominant role of Nursultan. Therefore, it's very important for Mr. Tokayev to maintain control over the upper house of parliament, Senate. Why? Because in the framework of our constitution, Mr. Tokayev, he has right to appoint 15 deputies in the Senate. Well, but it's very strange that in Kazakhstan, it's not federative state, it's a unitarian state, but we have two chambers of parliament. Well, Mr. Nazarbayev many years ago established these two chambers as like I said, some guarantee of stability, of political stability, but not for state, but for him. Well, another position of Mr. Nazarbayev. Nazarbayev, well, he's honorary. Nazarbayev, he is one of the senator in upper house of parliament too. Well, and in addition, Nazarbayev is a lifelong member of the Constitutional Council. Well, besides that, Mr. Nazarbayev, he is chairman of the Assembly of the People of Kazakhstan. This is state body was created in 1995 and is responsible for implementation of the state ethnic policy in Kazakhstan. Well, another position of Kazakhstan connected with the activity, Samruk-Kazyna National Welfare Fund. It's very important. Mr. Nazarbayev controls Samruk-Kazyna. But I'd like to say that this fund unites all national companies under the one roof. The fund's assets now account for about 45% of the national GDP. It's a very influential instrument of controlling of Kazakh economical system. Well, and in addition, Nazarbayev is an honorary chairman of the Supreme Eurasian Economical Council. And Nazarbayev, lifetime chairman of the Cooperation Council for Turkic-speaking states. Well, you see that Nazarbayev now have a lot of different positions in different spheres. It means that Nazarbayev control foreign policy, economical policy, internal policy. Well, yes, and Nazarbayev, of course, control the process of Nazarbayev control bureaucratic apparatus too. Why? Because in October 2019, President of Kazakhstan, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, signed a decree expanding the powers of chairman of Security Council, Mr. Nazarbayev, in personal policy. Well, the documents say that the head of state will agree with the chairman of the Security Council on the appointment of ministers, except for the heads of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and the Ministry of Defense. Well, Tokayev necessary to coordinate with Mr. Nazarbayev the appointment of the heads of all regions of Kazakhstan, the head of capital, and the head of Almaty and Shymkent. This is another very biggest city in Kazakhstan too. All these points to the mistake of some experts in Kazakhstan that believe that after the departure of Mr. Nazarbayev from the presidency in March 2019, in Kazakhstan appeared two equal centers of power. No, it's a mistake. We haven't equal center of power in Kazakhstan because Mr. Nazarbayev tried to be the main center of power in Kazakhstan. Well, but if we talk about the Tokayev political prospects, well, I'd like to say that Mr. Tokayev was elected for 5 years. And that's why he has maybe two variants of two political scenarios. First, with Nazarbayev alive, all these 5 years, Tokayev will be surrounded by red flags and limited in his action, especially when we say about the domestic politics, internal politics. But Tokayev will have more freedom in the social economic sphere, where he can voice different various initiatives. But his economic policies also have some boundaries. These borders run into the interest of influential oligarch groups from the circle of the first president, who are supporters of the preservation of the economy of favorites, oligarch economy in Kazakhstan. And second scenario, it's clear that Mr. Tokayev will have more independence after Nazarbayev leaves the political scene. And in this case, Mr. Tokayev will either have to quickly neutralize other members of the Nazarbayev's family, or get the support, some of them, in exchange for preserving their business. Well, I believe maybe if we talk about the members of Nazarbayev's family, maybe Mr. Kulibayev, one of son-in-law of Mr. Nazarbayev, maybe Mr. Kulibayev will be more close to Mr. Tokayev. Why? Because inside of, if you look to the family of Mr. Nazarbayev, you can see some contradiction between Mr. Kulibayev and one of the daughters of Mr. Nazarbayev, Dariga Nazarbayev. Well, it's very interesting inter-elite process now in Kazakhstan. And this conflict has very deep roots. And now we can see a lot of interesting events connected with this conflict. Well, and maybe Mr. Tokayev tried to attract some oligarchs in future and try, it's like, for example, Mr. Shavkat Mirziyoyev in Uzbekistan. You know that Mr. Shavkat Mirziyoyev now very close connected with Alisher Usmanov, one of the richest person in Russia, oligarch, and Alisher Usmanov tried to support Shavkat Mirziyoyev and tried to help him to realize some economical reform. And maybe in future Tokayev tried to attract some oligarchs in own political camp. Well, and I'd like to say that another person who will support Mr. Tokayev in future maybe will be young new generation of managers in bureaucratic apparatus of Kazakhstan, so-called generation of 70s. Now this person about 40, 30 years, well, 30 years, but this is person very ambitious. And maybe he expects to take key position as a result of personal reboot of system after Mr. Nazarbayev. And maybe Tokayev tried to attract new, young, very ambitious political elite in future. And maybe in future we can see some contradiction between oligarch and young person in political elite of Kazakhstan. It will be some contradiction between two generations, old generations and young generations of bureaucracy in Kazakhstan. Well, it's very short about current, maybe, not political, inter-elite situation in Kazakhstan. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's very fascinating. Nazarbayev has still a huge influence on the Kazakhstani political system. And actually, the room for maneuver of Tokayev is very tight, even if he wanted to implement like liberal reforms. Nevertheless, like there have been like three three kind of political reforms. Like he tried to show some political openness. And maybe very briefly, Mrs. Lillis, how could you assess the progress of these reforms 2 years into his presidency? Do you agree with Mr. Satpayev that actually like, there are no reform, that the influence of the old bureaucracy is still pregnant? Like very.
Yeah, broadly speaking, I mean, yeah, President Tokayev did embrace some kind of reform agenda. I mean, we mustn't forget what his buzzword is. His buzzword is listening state. He says he's going to make Kazakhstan into a listening state, and he said that a few months after he came to power. You know, I mean, his critics say that he's really not gotten very far to making Kazakhstan listen to its people. Now, his reform agenda, I mean, this was partly dreamt up in response to what I think was a surprising amount of pushback from the people after Nazarbayev's resignation. When I say surprising, I mean surprising to the government, to Nazarbayev, to Tokayev, and to all the elites in power. I think they were caught by surprise by the fact that so many people did go out onto the streets in Kazakhstan terms, maybe not huge protests in terms of some other countries. But as a result of watching these months and months of protests continue to unfold after the resignation, Tokayev, first of all, he promised this listening state, and at the same time, in fact, when he was giving his first big address to the nation a few months after he came to power, he promised some reforms. And he promised reforms specifically of the laws that are really the sticking points, if you like, or the real points of controversy that were creating that were creating the kind of clash between the authorities and the people. And that means laws about political freedoms and laws about the right to public assembly, the right to protest peacefully. And these are the things that had become real battlegrounds in Kazakhstan at that time after Nazarbayev's resignation. Battlegrounds between the government and the dissenters, basically, even if they're not that huge in number, but they're significant enough to make a presence on the streets. Now, I say they became a battleground after Nazarbayev's resignation. Well, these things remain a battleground because the reforms that he enacted really have been quite cosmetic. I mean, and certainly so has the implementation of these reforms, the practical impact on the ground. So very briefly, on political freedoms, Tokayev presided over changes to the law on political parties, which he said would make it easier to register political parties. One of the key changes, for example, in Kazakhstan, you have to gather a certain number of signatures to have the right to even try to register a political party, to present your papers to the Justice Ministry. And they reduced by half the number of signatures, from 40,000 to 20,000. Now, that's just one example. That was touted as a big democratizing moment. It's going to be much easier to register a political party. But what did we see when we got into the run-up to the parliamentary election in January? Not a single new party was registered. The exact same parties were able to stand in the election, and the exact same pro-government parties won seat in parliament. Because in actual practice, it has not become easier to register a political party. And the Justice Ministry itself said not long ago, I think, that there had been 8 refusals over that period of people who tried to register political parties and failed. So there is absolutely zero practical impact from that reform. On the right to protest, the government enacted a law which made it easier, they said, for people to exercise this right to protest peacefully by, for example, saying, okay, in the past you had to get our permission, the permission of local authorities to protest. Now you simply have to notify about your protest. However, the practical impact of that is that sometimes the authorities won't accept the notification. They say, no, we don't accept your notification. So there's absolutely no difference between not accepting a notification and refusing an application. So the practical impact is very small. However, having said that, legal protests do now take place in Kazakhstan, which certainly in the latter years of the Nazarbayev period, they never did. It was impossible to gain permission to protest in the latter days of the Nazarbayev, in the last years of Nazarbayev rule. But they now, some movements and some groups and some individuals are able to put the notification in and get them and be allowed to protest. And we have seen protests even calling for political reform in the center of Almaty, for example. However, I think we need to very, very, very strongly emphasize the caveat here. Now the government is using this new amended law on protest to kind of pick and choose, who do I accept as dissenters and who don't I accept? In other words, people are allowed to protest if the government says that they're acceptable. But if the government does not say that they're acceptable, then they are not allowed to protest, and then their protests are met with the same reactions as protests always were met with in the past, which is arrest, arrest, arrest. So we see two different kinds of protests now in Kazakhstan. That's what's changed. We see this kind of legal protests that take place peacefully without arrests by some groups, and then we see other protests where people don't give notification, and those groups are considered not acceptable by the government. So we see the government still really micromanaging and controlling the right to protest, and so the right to peaceful protest is still not assured in Kazakhstan.
Thank you very much. We will soon come back to this protest question because I think it's quite fundamental in the modern Kazakhstan. Maybe just to conclude on this part of what some have called transition of power, but we have seen with Mr. Satpayev that it is not at all a transition. Maybe Mrs. Poujol, you can talk about the last parliamentary election we were held last January. How could you assess the results of this election? And because even if Nursultan Nazarbayev's party has won in the election with like more than 70% of the votes, we have seen a huge, a very low level of participation in the big cities. So maybe it is a testimony of the lack of support of the population. And maybe you can share your ideas about the prospects of Kazakhstan, of Tokayev's Kazakhstan in the next years. Thank you.
I just said that it's not easy to make any prospect because the situation in each Central Asian states is so tricky that it's never happened as you think it will. As for the parliamentary election, as Mrs. Lillis said about the problem of opposition, if you remember what Tokayev said before the election, that it will be good for opposition party to come to join the deputies, and so this is blah 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 blah. The words that they have to be said. The question is definitely it looks like everything is done for any opposition not to register anyway. The question, just a few words about that. The question is the concept of opposition in post-Soviet states, in post-Soviet space. The opposition, it's not even 20,000 members to make a party better than 40,000. It's just one guy who is an opposant, a brilliant guy who is against the ruler. It's a big problem for the elite. So what we see in the parliamentary election is absolutely normal feature. Nursultan has lost 8 seats, but it's nothing because it's terribly majority. I think he has like 76 seats, about out of 100 and some, so like 7 seats. So it's a victory. We cannot say that it's the regime is not consolidated with this election, even if there are less people voting. Because, of course, if we see the percent of people voting, I was thinking to find them. I found, maybe my colleagues would tell me, 63% of voters that were elected. But if you see what is going on in Western democracies, the elections are are just attended by less people than 63. 63 is not so bad, in fact. 63 is just the symbol that it's less than before, because before it was already normal for Western states, for instance, like 80%, 90%, and so on. This is Soviet election. So for the first time, we see a drop, 63. But you know, there is not the way to call for fire. It's still high percent, I think. And the fact that there is a clash and a gap between the population and the elite, political elite. It's Kazakhstan, like everywhere in Central Asia and everywhere in the world. There is disconfidence. There is, what is in English, I don't say al-bol in French. The people are just fed up with the seeing their elite getting more rich and rich and rich and rich, and they are just disconnected. They are living in their own society, in their own circle, and the other are just around among them in another planet. It's the same state, but it's another planet with it. So I think the election is not a big deal. It's the first election for President Tokayev, but just a little less percent of participation. It's nothing. And no opposition could enter. This is the good results. The expected results, even if it was not said like that. But in fact, the fear of any word connected with opposition is like, you know, it reminds me like a sickness. We are living in the time of pandemic, but think about it. An oppositioner in post-Soviet states, it's like a virus in the society. You must just kill it or just expel it very far away, not to contaminate the remaining society. So the problem with the new law, with the less number of people to organize the party and whatever, is just to save time, to avoid the question of thinking in another way, destroying the equilibrium of the society. This is a big deal. It's a problem with every country in Russia, in China, in post-Soviet Union, and each country of Central Asia. So everything is okay. The president of Majlis was re-elected. The prime minister of Kazakhstan was re-elected, and I think the parliamentary election is not a historical event that will last in history of Kazakhstan, I think.
Thank you for your insight. Yeah, you were talking about thinking on another way, but actually in Kazakhstan there are movements that try to think on another way than the Nazarbayev's line. So maybe we can talk with Mrs. Lillis about the new activism that has emerged after the resign of Nazarbayev in 2019. For example, there is a movement, Oyan Kazakhstan, Wake Up Kazakhstan, which was launched during the last presidential election. So, Mrs. Lillis, what does this new urban activism tell us about Tokayev's Kazakhstan? Does the regime fear this trend? And how do you assess the audience of this new wave of opposition in the Kazakhstani society?
Thank you, Felix, for the question. Yeah, we have definitely seen the emergence of a new kind of activism since Nazarbayev's resignation. You mentioned Oyan Kazakhstan, which means Wake Up Kazakhstan, and was launched very soon by a group of young urban activists, mostly based in Almaty, launched very soon after Tokayev's resignation, and they wanted to they wanted to call for political reform. Basically, they wanted a parliamentary republic rather than a sort of a strong presidential rule, and all kinds of other liberal reforms. What form has the activism taken? Well, I mean, the critics of this group, they do criticize it for being kind of urban based, for not being in touch with grassroots concerns, for being kind of metropolitan liberals. That's what critics say. And a lot of the activism has been online, actually. Woyan Kazakhstan have been involved in protests on the streets as well. Now, notably, I mentioned before that the government has some groups it will tolerate and allow to protest and not arrest the people. And Woyan Kazakhstan is usually one of them. If they take to the streets these days, which is quite rare now, but the police tend to kind of kettle them into one place, and then they rarely get arrested. So they are tolerated by the government. And I think what we can see from that, or what we can say from that, is that no, the government does not feel any sense of threat from a group like Woyan Kazakhstan. I think they you know, a lot of their activism takes place on Instagram, and their protests have been quite colourful. Certainly, they have good eye for slogans and a good eye for the cameras and a good eye for sound bites. Now, they have, of course, done a great job in kind of raising awareness of some of these issues in Kazakhstan. I think especially, they had a lot of international media interest because they were a new thing and a breath of fresh air. But I can say that I don't see that the government sees them as any threat. The other things I would say about the opposition is you know, the treatment, say, of groups like Woyan Kazakhstan, or another group, for example, the Democratic Party of Kazakhstan, which is led by an activist named Janbolat Mamai, who is also allowed to protest, usually without arrest, is very different from the treatment that we see given to a group called Democratic Choice of Kazakhstan, which is led by Mukhtar Ablyazov, an oligarch who lives in France, has political asylum in France, and has been engaged in a bit of feud with the government for years and years and years now, really. And you know, for the government, that group is a red line, because basically their agenda is liberal reform. However, what the government sees them as is dangerous, because Ablyazov makes no secret of the fact that he is pursuing regime change via street protest. Now, the government is very afraid of that, if not of his group. Well, you know, this is something that the government sees as colored revolutions, of the kind of thing that's happened in Kyrgyzstan much more recently and in other countries. And they are very afraid of real street protests of the type that could topple a government. They are very afraid of that. And also, we have to say that the treatment meted out to supporters of a Democratic Choice of Kazakhstan is often, usually, completely disproportionate compared to their activities. For example, you know, they can go to jail for their Facebook posts, for expressing peaceful dissent, and so on. And I would definitely single out there, this is the result of a personal feud between Ablyazov and Nazarbayev that leads the government to treat these people as very dangerous dissenters, and they do face real consequences for their support. Again, we shouldn't over-exaggerate the numbers. I mean, their protests, even at the height after the resignation of Nazarbayev, you know, they were rarely able to gather more than 500 people. These days, we can't even see how many people they can gather, because the government has gone back to the tactics of kind of simply not letting them gather when they try to protest, and they preemptively arrest them from home, or they simply can't reach the site they're trying to get to. So it's really hard to judge their support. How much support they have, but that is the red line for the government, and that is the group the government fears, but probably because it's simply paranoid about the personal bitterness between Ablyazov and Nazarbayev. And just before I finish, I'd like to make one point about the organized opposition, the kind of opposition that used to stand in elections in Kazakhstan. I think in the presidential election last year was the first presidential election in, I think, in 14 years where there was a candidate who had any kind of claim on his CV to having engaged in real opposition politics. That was Amijan Kosanov, who was a member of liberal opposition for many, many years, for 20 years. That kind of organized opposition that existed legally, that stood in elections, that even at one time challenged Nazarbayev for the presidency, but stood in elections, in parliamentary elections till 2012. I think that election with Nazarbayev facing Kosanov marked the end of that whole era of opposition. That opposition is completely finished. It really doesn't exist anymore in Kazakhstan. And I think we can say that this is, it's also worth pointing out that the government's attempts to eradicate that opposition, to pressurize it out of existence when it was very moderate, has backfired on the government itself, because that opposition, you could have dealt with that opposition. If they'd let that opposition get into parliament a few years ago, then there would have been somewhere to go with opposition, having opposition. Instead, they've driven that out of existence. They've delegitimized it. I mean, Kosanov's presence in the election was considered by many people a mere smokescreen, window dressing, and it's finished his political career, certainly. And so the government didn't want to deal with that moderate opposition, but now they find themselves having to deal with, say, Democratic Choice of Kazakhstan, with an opposition group that wants to overthrow the regime by a street protest. So that's the result.
Thank you for this very clear overview of the state of the opposition in Kazakhstan. But there is a kind of opposition we haven't talked about yet, maybe with Mrs. Poujol who talk about. I mean, the Islamist opposition. Indeed, there are not a lot of papers or like I haven't seen a lot of work done on the Islamic movement now in Kazakhstan, whereas like the government is very secular, but there have been terror attacks to 2011 in the country. There have been fighters in Syria who came back to the country. So Mrs. Poujol, how could we like very briefly assess the influence on of this Islamic movement, on what could be their prospects?
You know, thank you. You know, the question is very tricky because the Kazakh government used to apply the adjective of terrorist Islamist for any opposition movement based on social and religious wishes, basis. So all the events that took place in Kazakhstan, and they are not so numerous if we compare to others, the country, because Kazakhstan is not a target for terrorist acts in the world, this is for sure. Even if a few hundred people went to ISIS, like in other Central Asian states, but Kazakhstan is not that country where terrorism and Islamist political Islam is rooted. But still, there were different moments before 2011. In 2005, 6, 7, in the oil western region of Kazakhstan, few not very special movement, just few militants that will just expose themselves with a policeman or so on. But you know, the question is, Kazakhstan is like the other country of Central Asia, a country of post-Soviet ideology of secularism, where the majority of the population is definitely Muslim, but special Muslims who are the target of special movement, Islamic movement, mostly non-violent movement, but mostly say conservative and Salafist movement. So the question is better to think about Kazakhstan like a country where the process of Salafization of the spirit, Salafization of most of the population is going on, then political Islam, which exists, but among a large choice of other movements to oppose to the government. So if you have just the offer of how to be an opponent in Kazakhstan today, just to be against the ruling power and to do something new, you have a lot of different groups. Among them, you have, of course, some movements, Islamist movements, because they are all connected between, but it's not the ground, it's not a special, even it's not Uzbekistan. I would say Kazakhstan is very, it's much more connected to oil, economy, poverty, big gap between the very poor and the very rich, and Islam inside this field, which feel a special niche. But it's not like in other countries like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, where the ground is definite. But you must ask Dosym, because Dosym must have maybe a better idea than me of the situation, because he lives inside. Like Joanna, I understand. Please, just I give the floor to Dosym to add what I was saying. Maybe he has another idea of that.
Mr. Satpayev, if you want to add something.
Yes, well, it's very interesting when we talk about the Kazakh opposition. If we look to the history of political opposition of Kazakhstan, maybe we can see two periods. First and 19th, very active political parties, a lot of NGO, a lot of mass media. Joanna knows about it. Well, it's like it's in another post-Soviet countries. It was some pro-Western romanticism. Well, and a lot of people who participated in different opposition political parties, they really tried to establish in Kazakhstan some Western model of democracy, Western model of democracy. But now, if you ask a lot of people who participated in some different opposition movement, I'm not sure that the most part of them will support Western model of democracy. It's very important. Well, I believe maybe now, I'd like to say that the period of very active opposition movement in Kazakhstan, first period, maybe finished 2005. I remember that after the first revolution in Kyrgyzstan, well, in Kazakhstan, our state power, very strong pressure to different NGO, to different political parties, to different mass media, because our political elite are afraid of some revolution in Kazakhstan as like it's in Kyrgyzstan. Well, I remember a lot of blah, blah, blah about the Orange Revolution after the Ukraine, after the Georgia in Kazakhstan. Well, but now we can see maybe a bit new kind of opposition. I'd like to say that Joanna is right when she say about the different group of opposition. Well, because Kazakh opposition is not monolith group. Kazakh opposition consists of different group. Well, for example, we have very interesting kind of opposition. It's online opposition, sofa opposition. These are people very strong, criticize political power, political elite, but these people didn't go to the square, to the streets. These people is not going to participate in offline opposition movement. But it's very important. When we talk about the future, I mean post-Nazarbayev period, I believe that in future, when we say about the political area, will be more active too, ideological mainstream. First, national patriotic, and second, religious movement. Well, it's not only connected. Well, when we say about the religious movement, it's not only connected with the increasing of role of Islam in Kazakh society, especially when we say about the young people. Because yes, it's like it's in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan and other Central Asia countries, a lot of young people now try to find themselves in religious self-identification. Well, but for me, more interesting, who in our political elite will support different model of religious development of Kazakhstan in future? It's like it's in Turkey, for example. Well, because I know that some person in our political elite, it's very religious person. This is people maybe in future will try to realize some model of development of political system of Kazakhstan, as like it's in Turkey, when religious will play more political role than in past. Well, but very short about the opposition. Well, I'd like to say that Joanna talk about the very active participation of young people, especially after the resignation of Mr. Nazarbayev. Yes, it's very important because a lot of young people now try to be more political activity. Well, if you look to election, presidential election and parliament election, a lot of young people try to be observer, independent observer during the election. But unfortunately, our state power stopped this activity. Well, but I'd like to say that new opposition in Kazakhstan will become not only younger, but also more Kazakh-speaking opposition. It's very important. It means that national patriotic movements, national patriotic ideas will be very popular in Kazakhstan in future. And now we can see that a lot of national patriotic ideas, it's very popular in Kazakh language society, in Kazakh language part of society, of Kazakhstan society. Well, I'd like to say that it is my point of view that era of Russian speaking opposition will finish soon. It's very important because in 19th, if you look to the political history of Kazakhstan, in 19th, it was Russian-speaking opposition. Now will be Kazakh-speaking opposition. And it's very interesting for me, how will be relationship between national patriotic movements and religious movements? Because if you look to the national patriotic movements of Kazakhstan, you can find a lot of different groups and a lot of contradiction between them. Some part of groups try to talk only about the Kazakh language. And other groups try to talk about the Russian, about the threats from Russia, from China. Well, another national patriotic movements talk about the third way of political development of Kazakhstan, not together with Western, not together with East, but it's only Kazakh way, special Kazakh way. When we say about the political development. And if you look to the religious field of Kazakhstan, you can find the same situation. A lot of different religious groups and some contradiction between them. Yes, Catherine mentioned about the Salafism, Salafi idea. Yes, it's very popular in some part of Kazakh society, but if we talk about the contradiction, we can see, for example, some people who support Sufism. Sufism, yes, and this people is very strong. It's very strong fighting with spread of Salafism idea in Kazakhstan. And another group, for example, they very strong support Tengri. Well, it's a very deep root Kazakh religious before Islam. Well, and that's why it's very interesting process we can see in religious fields of Kazakhstan and national patriotic movement of Kazakhstan, and it will be very strong challenges, very strong problem for Tokayev, if Tokayev will be president after Nazarbayev, because Kazakh society in Kazakhstan is very fragmented. It's not very monolith, a lot of contradiction, and contradiction not only between different national patriotic groups, between different religious groups, but very strong contradiction, Joan mentioned about it, between Russian-speaking society and Kazakh-speaking society. Well, it's very big problems for Mr. Tokayev. Well, and maybe my last point of view. Well, in 2019, I saw very strong wave of protest activity in Kazakhstan. But last year, I saw new wave of protest activity, maybe not only connected with the participation in different demonstration, political action and square. No, I mean that epidemic of coronavirus in Kazakhstan established very good basis to appear to new protest moods, protest sentiments in Kazakhstan, because a lot of people in Kazakhstan, they saw very low effectiveness of political system of Kazakhstan, very low effectiveness of state structures in Kazakhstan. Well, when we say about the effectiveness fighting with epidemic of coronavirus, and it's very big problems for power, because a lot of people who before will be very loyal to the Mr. Tokayev, to the Nazarbayev, this is people that think, well, okay, Nazarbayev is not very good, Tokayev is not very good, but more important is that in Kazakhstan we haven't war, we haven't civic war, we haven't very violence as like it's in Ukraine, in other countries. But now these people, after the epidemic of coronavirus, very strong opposition, well, they supported opposition idea now, because these people understood, well, this is power, not very effectiveness. This is power is not going to protect us during the crisis situation. Well, it's very important. It's very important that now in Kazakh society, you can find new wave of protest moods, new wave of protest activity, maybe in online, but it's very important point of view. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Satpayev, for all your insights about the fragmentation of the opposition itself, but also of the Kazakh society on broader perspective. But we're unfortunately already running out of time. We wanted to talk also about foreign policy, but I've seen there are some questions about it, and you also expressed, Mr. Satpayev, this role of the Russian language as a kind of divisive factor inside the Kazakhstani society. So maybe very briefly, how is the influence of Russia in Kazakhstan? Is this influence a threat, especially considering like the northern part of the country is inhabited by Russians and by Russian-speaking population? How do you see like the perspectives of the Kazakhstani-Russian relations in the recent future? Maybe Mr. Satpayev or Ms. Poujol?
Well, it's very sensitive problem for Kazakhstan when we talk about the Russia, because if you look to the Kazakh society, it's very interesting. Kazakhstan, it's only one state in maybe in Central Asia where you can find anti-Russian, anti-China movements. Yes, well, the same situation we can see, for example, in Kyrgyzstan, but we can talk only about the anti-China activities. Because you know that in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan last time was organized different demonstration, anti-China protest actions, because China opened some camp in Xinjiang and very strong pressure to the ethnic minorities, to Kazakh, to Kyrgyz people, to Uyghur people. Yes, but if you look to Kazakhstan, you can find another problems. It's anti-Russian activities. Well, I'd like to say that before 2014, a lot of fears in Kazakh society was about the China, a lot of fears. But after 2014, after the confrontation between Russia and Ukraine, yes, now we can see a lot of fears about the Russia. Yes, and I'd like to say that especially in Kazakh language, part of Kazakh society, you can find a lot of anti-Russian moods. Well, and because, well, Russia now realizes not too friendly foreign policy. to another post-Soviet countries. Because, well, maybe you know that last time some Russian officials, well, some deputies, some Russian politicians, very influential journalists, last times they talked a lot about the territorial claims to Kazakhstan. Well, Mr. Putin, for example, sometimes he talked about the some gifts of Russian people, territorial gifts of Russian people to neighbors, not only to Ukraine, but to Belarus, to Kazakhstan. Well, Mr. Zhirinovsky very often talk about some territorial claims to Kazakhstan. Well, it means that after, well, I believe that in Moscow, they are afraid of that after Mr. Nazarbayev, Kazakhstan will be more maybe independent from Russia. Well, as like it's maybe Azerbaijan, maybe Georgia. Well, because if we talk about the foreign policy of post-Soviet countries, we should remember that this is foreign policy very strong connected with the concrete person of president. Mr. Nazarbayev, yes, he very strong connected with Russian political elite. Mr. Nazarbayev, he believes that he's establisher, he's founder, he's founder of Eurasia Economical Union. Well, in compare with Mr. Tokayev, because for Mr. Tokayev, Eurasia Economical Union, it's not very native product. It's not child for Mr. Tokayev as like as for Mr. Nazarbayev, because for Mr. Nazarbayev, Eurasia Economical Union is like as a child. Well, that's why Mr. Nazarbayev everywhere talk. Well, Eurasia Economical Union, it's very profitable for Kazakhstan. We should do very strong cooperate with Russia. No, Mr. Tokayev last time tried to criticize Eurasia Economical Union. It's very interesting. Well, and Mr. Tokayev last time, it's my point of view, tried to receive support from national patriotic oriented people in Kazakhstan. Because, for example, in the beginning of this year, in some article, Tokayev in this article, Tokayev emphasized that we should to develop Kazakh language, we should to support migration Kazakh people from the south part of Kazakhstan to the north part of Kazakhstan. We should to pay more attention to some part of Kazakh history connected with the famine in last century. Well, I believe that Tokayev tried to receive some support from the national patriotic oriented people. Well, but if you look to our political elite, it's very important. You can find a lot of representatives of political elite who are very pro-Russian oriented, very pro-Russian oriented. This is people very close connected with political and business elite of Russia. Some part of these people, they have business in Russia. Well, if you look to the future, well, maybe a very negative scenario for Kazakhstan, if in our political elite will be very strong contradiction, as like it's in Ukraine. It's very dangerous for Kazakhstan if some part of political elite will try to receive support from Russia in this struggle, in this contradiction. I'm not sure that another part of elite will try to support from China. No, I believe that some part of Kazakh political elite will try to receive support from Russia. It will be a very dangerous situation for Kazakhstan because Russia tried to interfere in internal policy in Kazakhstan in future. It's like it's in Ukraine. Russia will try to support Russian language speaking in Kazakhstan. Well, and Russia try, well, if you look to the, for example, to the new military doctrine of Russia, you can find very dangerous thesis for Kazakhstan. Because in this doctrine, Russia emphasized that Russia can to interfere in internal policy all post-Soviet countries if Russia will see some dangers for Russian-speaking people in these countries. That's why Russia can to support these people. Well, that's why if we talk about the future, I believe we have a lot of problems with Russia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Satpayev. Just to follow this discussion on foreign policy, like there have been a question by Mr. Marchevich about the perspectives of the future Kazakhstani-Chinese relations, because we have talked about Russia, but there's also like a huge challenge with the expansion of China, mainly through the Belt and Road Initiative. So maybe Mrs. Lillis or Mrs. Poujol, if you want to say a few words about the prospects of these relations with China.
Kazakhstan definitely started to keep the balance, at least officially, the balance between China, Russia, USA, and Europe and EU. This is the official position. The political elite is not naive and sees the project, Silk Road project of China, One Road, One Belt, as, of course, an opportunity. But the question is, opportunity for who? The opportunity to cross briefly Kazakhstan and to go further to Europe. And I think the question is very touchy, because the question of China is one connected with loans, very easy to get loans, and Kazakhstan knows perfectly the situation in Tajikistan and in Kyrgyzstan, where the external debt is already 50% under the arms of China. So they definitely see the problem in how can it trace further. And also there is the question of the lands. I mean, the huge amount of empty lands in Kazakhstan, which can be bought by Chinese peasants. And there was problems from 2016 and even before, and now about the law on the land law, to give the capability to have the land for almost 1 century. So it's a very big deal, and it's very touchy for the elite, the Kazakh elite, to take any step further in this position, because the Kazakh people don't want to give their land to the Chinese. This is for sure. So definitely Kazakhstan is between the arm and the I don't know the word in English, between Russia and between China. I see definitely the relationship with Russia are worsening since, as the Dosym said, 2014, because the Crimea, Nazarbayev didn't say it's a good thing, it's wonderful, and he didn't give his word on that. And Putin had to punish him. He punished him, saying that I congratulate the first, you remember, the first president of the first Kazakh state, which was definitely an offense for Nazarbayev, who immediately organized the 550 centuries of the Kazakh state, conferences all over the country. That was in 2015. But it was at that time, in 2015, the beginning of the less openly good relationship between Russia and between Kazakhstan and Russia. And so it's true that Tokayev is doing something, especially I think he didn't sign the political integration project of the Economic Council, the project 2020-2025, and he didn't sign it, and he said, I have to further study it. And this is a big sign that is definitely stop to follow Russia. But it's not. I mean, it's not a new thing. I just want to connect this policy with the policy of Nazarbayev, who definitely is a little bit scared about the way the Russian Federation is considering the near neighbor Kazakhstan, with whom is sharing 7,000 kilometer frontier, like is definitely is vassal. It's not. It's the way that will be changed. That cannot continue like that. So I think the future of the international relationship for Kazakhstan is very. Maybe the middle-sized actors will gain in favor than the big one. Maybe EU, which is a big economic client for sure for Kazakhstan. So we'll see. The question is the departure of American soldiers is also a drop of American influence. So I'm afraid anyway that Kazakhstan must deal definitely with the couple, the terrible couple, Russian-Chinese. There's the historical and geographical neighbors. That's for sure. Thank you.
That's the main challenge because of its pretty hard geographical location. Thank you very much, Mrs. Poujol, and our speakers. Fortunately, 1 hour and a half it's not enough to speak about this so passionate country. So we're already running out of time. Thank you again, Mrs. Lillis, Mrs. Poujol, and Mr. Satpayev. If there are no questions, I will let the floor to Anastasia for the final word.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Hubert Felix, and thank you to the team for excellent preparation prepared by the editorial team. Thank you very much for Hubert Felix, to Charles-Adrien, and to Dylan for their preparation. Thank you for everybody for joining. I would like to share just two announcements very briefly. One is about our next event. It's on Russia, and the topic is the lessons from Russian voters in 2019-2020. We are going to look at parallels with the protests in Belarus, assess the efficiency and efficacy of the smart voting versus demonstrations, and of course for the state versus for the protesters themselves. We are going to think about the future of Russian opposition following the arrest of Alexei Navalny, and the future of the presidency, of course, in the succession after the constitutional reform. We're going to have this conference on May 20th between 5 p.m. and 6:30 p.m. Central Eastern Time. This is going to be also on Zoom, and we are going to share the link by email that you have received, and then on media subscription through the subscription link. And looking forward to seeing you on May 20th. Thank you very much to the speakers. Excellent introduction, fascinating conference, extraordinarily interesting, and I think really thank you so much for joining, for taking the time.